War has always been a house of horrors. While many, in many ages of human history, have found purpose, fulfillment in the forges of war, the darkest dungeons of what humans can do are always behind the corner, looming, held down by weak chains of honor and rules. So, while the beast living in the depths of the human condition can be found anywhere in war, there is one situation where it is unleashed in every society, at every level, in every culture. The moment when a city falls, the moment where a siege is completed, the sack. When an army sacks a city, a bell is rung. And much like those signaling the apocalypse, these bells cannot be unrung. Today, we will follow the sources and try to understand what happened when a city fell in Roman times, in medieval times, and even in times closer to us, in the modern age. Let's get into it. The sack was not just an accident of war in the Roman world. It was a ritual, a weapon, and a warning. When a city defied Rome, especially after it had been offered terms and refused, the destruction that followed was methodical and deeply symbolic. What followed was not merely pillaging, it was theater, where civilization was stripped away and replaced with spectacle. In Polybius' account of the Roman capture of New Carthage in 209 BC during the Second Punic War, we see a glimpse of this cold efficiency cloaked in savagery. According to him, Scipio Africanus, before permitting any pillaging, ordered his troops to kill all who resisted, regardless of status. Only once resistance was utterly broken did he allow the soldiers to collect loot. They killed the inhabitants indiscriminately. No one was spared, not even the animals, says Polybius. The mutilation of animals, particularly dogs, was not accidental. It was a kind of psychological warfare. The bodies of dogs were displayed near temples and civic spaces as a visual cue to any other Iberian cities considering defiance. The Roman army knew what it was doing. Cities that resisted were punished not only for their defiance, but for undermining Roman dignity. In the case of Illiturgis, during the same war, Appian records an even more disturbing scene. The city had previously supported Rome but switched alliance to Carthage. When Scipio recaptured it in 206 BC, he made no distinction between the guilty and the innocent. Quote, "He ordered all the inhabitants to be massacred. Neither women, children, nor the elderly were spared." Livy adds that not even temples offered sanctuary. Those who fled there were dragged out and killed on the altars. This was not just about vengeance, it was about sending a message. A city that betrayed Rome would be unmade. And this is why some people were selected to survive the sack. The destruction of Illiturgis would echo beyond its borders. Fear, not conquest, was the objective. Roman law and practice permitted 3 days of unrestricted looting after a successful sack. This tradition, borrowed from the Greeks but honed with more discipline, meant that Roman troops knew their reward was coming. And this is where we move on from strategy and into the depths of what humans can do. In practice, this turned cities into feeding grounds. Women were hunted like animals. In Appian's account of the sack of Numantia in 133 BC, the city's final moments were a descent into despair. Facing defeat after years of siege, many Numantines chose suicide. Those who didn't were subjected to horrors that modern minds might associate with war crimes. Appian tells us that Roman troops, driven by a hunger for reward, seized anything that moved. Women, children, livestock. There was no distinction between the looting of valuables and the trafficking of humans. Young girls in particular were a prime target, not simply for, sexual violence, but because they could be sold at higher prices on the slave markets of Rome. Plutarch, in his Life of Sertorius, even records that survivors of these cities were sometimes kept alive not out of mercy, but out of a calculated plan to sell them for the greatest possible profit. So even the glimpses of mercy where they helped them survive would be motivated by more basic instincts. Now, of course, it was the way of the time, one could say. Slavery at the time was a practice recognized and used. It was part of the economic system. It was even a part of the political debate, as we saw with the Gracchi trying to get slaves out of the work pool a little bit in order to get jobs for the Romans. So before you thinking, I'll tell you, I'm not trying to apply a modern sensibility to horrors of the time, but there is a difference. There is a difference between the moments where the Romans or any other people would just take slaves and the sack, the moment in which they would descend like packs of wolves over people and literally tear them limb from limb, fighting because one soldier wanted a girl and another 8, 10 wanted the same girl, and so they would just pull and fight and push. Yes, the violence also turned inward. As looting intensified, soldiers began to kill each other, at least in Numantia. Roman accounts rarely highlight this directly, but hints survive. During the sacking of New Carthage, Polybius says that order broke down in some quarters. Officers were forced to pull their men back as internal skirmishes broke out over gold and female captives. This chaos wasn't punished, it was expected. Roman military commanders, like Scipio, would allow it to play out as long as the broader mission was achieved. The sack became a moment where discipline was suspended, a pressure valve for the army pent-up rage. The social rules of Rome, the laws, customs, class distinctions, evaporated. In those 3 days, a Roman legion became a mob with a license to destroy. Now you know how we like sources, so it's important to note how thoroughly Roman sources attempt to justify these actions. Livy, for instance, narrates these horrors not with disgust, but with reverence. The slaughter at the Liturgis, he writes, was necessary to re-establish Roman authority. Even Polybius, who admired Scipio but had some distance from Rome's political narrative, treats the destruction of New Carthage as a triumph of moral superiority. The idea was simple: those who defied Rome deserved to be broken. And so, entire cities disappeared from maps and memory. Fregelle, for instance, a Latin colony that rebelled in 125 BC, was not merely defeated, it was erased. Archaeology tells us that city was not rebuilt. The Romans dismantled it stone by stone and dumped the refuse over the ruins. Cicero, writing a century later, refers to Fregelle only as a cautionary tale. Its name had become shorthand for defiance punished by oblivion. From inside the walls, from the victims of the sack, we of course have no surviving accounts, but the archaeological record hints at chaos. Burn layers at sites like Numantia show high-temperature fires, often originating in granaries and temples, suggesting deliberate destruction of food stores and sacred spaces. Corpses, sometimes unburied, have been found with signs of blunt trauma, decapitation, and in some cases torture. One particularly grim find in Numantia was a pit containing the remains of dozens of children, many of whom had died violently. Whether they were killed by Romans or their own families to prevent capture is unclear, but either way it speaks to a collapse of humanity under siege. Roman soldiers were not uniquely cruel by the standards of ancient world, but what made Roman sackings distinct was their scale and intentionality. These were not chaotic acts of revenge, they were policy. They didn't just happen, they were accounted for. A city could be offered clemency if it surrendered, but resistance unlocked the gates to hell. The soldiers in a Roman army would often pray for the city not to surrender. They would want the sack to happen because that is their payday, the biggest one. Even Roman citizens were not immune. In 87 BC, during the civil wars between Marius and Sulla, Rome itself witnessed something akin to a sack. After Marius seized control, he unleashed his troops on the city. According to Plutarch, the streets ran with blood, heads were displayed on pikes, and no home was safe. This was not a foreign conquest, it was a Roman consuming its own capital. The memory of this moment lingered long after the bodies were cleared. Cicero later referred to the Marian purges as a stain upon the soul of Rome. The sack had come home. It is also interesting to say that in the same civil war, Sulla conquered Rome and did not sack it. He held his soldiers back. Now, I'm not saying Sulla was the best one, after all, Sulla was the father of the proscriptions, but it is interesting to notice that to sack or not to sack become political actions. Not to do it is an important enough thing that we remember it, because the sources remember it. It is interesting to notice that the Romans were so ritualistic in everything they did that they had rituals following a sack that show how they attempted to reintegrate order after chaos. Captured cities would often be rededicated with religious ceremonies. Triumphs in Rome were staged not just to celebrate the general, but to ritualistically absorb the violence back into the Roman civic body. The army of citizens re-enters the city, leaving the horrors behind. What they bring back is the results of the horrors. Captives were marched through the streets, displayed like trophies, and the people that were taken from the city that was sacked were repurposed into entertainment. Before we move on to the Middle Ages, I have to say that not all sackings were planned. Sometimes the violence spiraled beyond control. In 146 BC, when Scipio Aemilianus sacked Carthage during the Third Punic War, the destruction was so complete that he is said to have wept. According to Appian, as he watched the flames consume the city, he wept, visualizing the possibility that this could happen to Rome in the future. And well, it did. If Roman sackings were a weaponized ritual meant to protect imperial authority, then medieval sackings were often a chaotic fusion of religious fervor, feudal vengeance, and unchained brutality. The veneer of Christendom did not blunt the knife. In many cases, it sharpened it. Medieval chroniclers, especially ecclesiastical ones, recorded sacking not only as military events, but as tests of divine justice, or its terrifying absence. In an age where cities were walled sanctuaries of both wealth and faith, their sack became an apocalyptic moment, in which civilization did not just collapse, but was often inverted. Churches were burned, holy relics were defiled, and entire populations were wiped out in orgiastic violence. Few events capture this more grotesquely than the sack of Béziers in 1209. During the opening days of the Albigensian Crusade. Béziers was a city in southern France, known for its population of Cathars, considered heretics by the Catholic Church. When the crusading army approached the city, it demanded the surrender of all heretics. The citizens refused. The siege was brief. Before the main assault could even begin, a contingent of crusaders breached the gate during a skirmish and flooded into the city. What followed was a massacre so complete that even the Pope's legate expressed astonishment. According to Cesarius of Heisterbach, a Cistercian chronicler who claimed to have received the story from the general who led the battle, the soldiers asked how to distinguish heretics from Catholics. Their commander reportedly answered, "Kill them all, God will know his own." Whether or not those were the exact words said at the time, the spirit of them defined the event. Between 15,000 and 20,000 people were killed, men, women, and children. No attempts were made to sort believer from heretic. Churches were set ablaze, with parishioners inside. Women were taken in front of their families, sometimes on the thresholds of chapels. Monks were cut down mid-prayer. The sack lasted several days. The smell of burning flesh, say some local account, was so thick it lingered in the countryside for weeks. A pro-crusade chronicler, Peter of Vaux-de-Cernay, admits, "Our men spared no one, irrespective of rank, sex, or age. Even livestock were slaughtered en masse, partly to break the local economy, partly because anything associated with Béziers was considered tainted by heresy. The destruction was framed not only as justified, but sacred. The city was an offering consumed on the altar of God's wrath. A few years later, similar horror would befall Carcassonne and other Cathar strongholds. This time, however, more attention was paid to profit. Once the pattern was established, siege, refusal, slaughter, military leaders began planning not just to win, but how to extract maximum value from the carnage. Nobles negotiated rights to loot specific churches or quarters before the fighting even began. Women were often kept alive if young and unwed. The structure of the sack was formalized and made into a profit machine. Such scenes were not exclusive to religious warfare, though. Feudal and dynastic conflicts produced their own theaters of cruelty. With no sacred punishment to deliver, men still found a way to create the slaughterhouse. During the 100 Years' War, for example, the English and French armies frequently sacked each other's towns with systematic brutality. In 1346, after the Battle of Caen, Edward III allowed his troops to plunder the city for 3 days. Contemporary English chroniclers, Geoffrey Le Baker, describes the massacre in gleeful terms. They left no one merchant unslain, nor spared the wailing of the women. The French chronicler Jean Froissart, more measured, admits that there was no mercy. The city was taken by the sword. All were put to death who could not ransom themselves. In every case, we see a pattern. The sack was justified by betrayal, magnified by religious or political fervor, and executed with intentional cruelty. Medieval Christians did not see themselves as less violent than their pagan ancestor. They believed their violence was holier. What the Romans had done for order, they did for salvation. And like the Romans, they too had their rituals. After a sack, masses were held. Cities were rededicated again. Loot was offered to churches as a tithe. Crusaders claimed indulgences after committing horrible atrocities, of course. This cognitive dissonance, the merging of murder and mercy, of sexual violence and righteousness, pervades medieval narratives of war in, let's say it, practically all culture. I now use the Crusaders as an example, but every culture has the same situation going on. One might think that things would become better in the modern age, so let us take a walk through the modern inferno. May 1631. Magdeburg, Protestant city, fell to the Imperial Catholic League forces under Tilly. The siege had lasted months, and when the city finally fell, order disintegrated instantly. According to Otto von Guericke, a city council member who survived, over 20,000 people died. He wrote that it was no more terrible a work of divine punishment since the destruction of Jerusalem. A letter attributed to Count Peppenheim, one of the Catholic commanders, tearfully noted, "All of our soldiers became rich, God with us." The looting extended so long that charred bodies were dumped into the Elbe to prevent disease for weeks afterwards. The city remained rubble until at least 1720. Now, why did this happen? Why do this kind of sacks happen in general? Is it just greed? In this case, we know that the soldiers had gone unpaid for months. They saw Magdeburg as a final opportunity to make money. While commanders eventually ordered a halt, the damage was done. Churches were sacked, women violated, neighborhoods burned. Survivors fled into the cathedral or monasteries, safe havens, until even those sanctuaries were violated. So while modern times had made these things a little bit more of an exception, it could still happen at any time. Like in Rome in 1527. A turning point in European history. The Holy City was consumed by mutiny, mercenary violence, and religious fervor. Imperial troops, known to the Italians as the Lanzichenecchi, took initiative after long periods without pay and attacked the city. Mutiny meant that discipline collapsed completely. Religious resentment broke loose. The German Protestants, the Lanzichenecchi, felt they were punishing idolatrous Rome itself, while Spanish Catholics, accompanying them, well, they just did it for the booty. The Swiss Guard heroically defended St. Peter's, allowing Pope Clement VII to flee via a tunnel to Castel Sant'Angelo, the still-standing Passetto. He remained in the Castello for months. Some estimates that half of the population died through massacre, starvation, epidemic, or flight. The Eternal City became a plaything for people who were rebelling against their own officers, without any restraint. In this theater of destruction, some incredible scenes were created. Pilgrimage images were defiled in grotesque mockeries of communion. One satirical scene, a prostitute in priestly garb sang "Vivat Lutherus Pontifex" atop the apostolic symbols themselves, while soldiers mocked the hierarchy in print and action. To many of the Protestants, this was divine retribution, glimpsing Rome as Babylon fallen. Contemporary observers could barely believe it. One Venetian ambassador likened the experience to worse than hell itself. So, what can we say after all of these sacks that we have analyzed? Behind every sack lay a paradox. Violence was framed as justice, predation as righteousness, chaos as divine or political necessity. In each case, cities were not merely conquered, they were annihilated as a community. Sacred buildings burned, social fabric torn, survivors irreparably altered. What unites them across centuries isn't the scale, but method, a ritual repeated again and again that seems ingrained in the human spirit. First, the siege and the surrender. Then, massacre and terror. Next, looting and market logic. Finally, silence and reconsecration. There is something about the end of a long siege that brings out the wolf in the spirit of man. What do you think it is? Do you believe you would succumb to barbarity in this situation? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one. Have a good one.